All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sonia Lee, and I'm a science educator here at the Discovery Center in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And welcome to the Arctic Marine Life webcast. Canada is an Arctic nation, and only a small percentage of Canadians actually live there. So how do we, us folk in the South, and all of you joining from elsewhere in the world, how do we know about these fascinating marine creatures that live in the Arctic? Well, the Vancouver Aquarium is presenting an Arctic Marine Life course. And this course is supported by the Science in Canada's North Café Scientifique series, and we'd like to acknowledge the support of the W. Garfield Weston Foundation and the Canadian Association of Science Centres for their support. Other partners for the webcast is the Alliance of Natural History Museums of Canada, Canada's accredited zoos and aquariums, TELUS Spark in Calgary, the Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa, and the Discovery Center here in Halifax. So more information about the online course is available at vanaqua.org. Just type it in there. You'll get more info. So today here in Halifax, our speaker is Dr. Chris Harvey-Clark. He is the Director of Animal Care at Dalhousie University. And Dr. Chris Harvey-Clark's research focuses on the veterinary aspects of reptiles, amphibians, and fish, and particularly sharks. Today his presentation will focus on Greenland sharks. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Harvey-Clark.
Thank you, Sonia. I noticed Sonia tripping over words a little bit there, and she isn't the first one to call me Harvey Shark. So anyway, we'll get started with just a little bit about the Greenland shark, and I'm going to give you an outline in a second. But I think, especially for the young biologists in the audience, the really exciting thing for me about this has been really to be one of the first people to spend a significant amount of time in the environment with this animal. And I think one of the things to take home for biologists is you learn an awful lot by being in the field and by direct observation. So you'll notice the title is Unknown Monsters, Dreamless Sleepers. And this comes from Steinbeck. If those of you who've read his book, Log from the Sea of Cortez, he makes this astounding statement, which has begun to resonate, especially the last 10 or 15 years, about an ocean without its unnamed monsters being like a completely dreamless sleep. And I think in my quest for the Greenland shark, searching for this monster and discovering it was very exciting, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. The image you see there is me outside a shark cage off Halifax about 15 years ago. We had no idea what we were doing at that time diving with sharks. We thought they were ferocious beasts. We built a shark cage that would have withstood ramming by a large rhinoceros, and we saw some little blue sharks, and we were very excited about that. That was a Canadian first. So a few things, and by the way, what you're looking at there, lower right screen, is something called Harvey-Clark. Harvey-Clark is an Icelandic delicacy. It's basically shark cheese. It's Greenland shark that's been dried and fermented, and it sounds disgusting, but it actually tastes a bit like camembert. Anyway, just to get on, we're going to talk a bit about the biology of the shark. I'm going to tell you a little murder mystery of the corkscrew killer, and then tell you about the search for and the discovery of Greenland sharks in Lower Canada. So what about the Greenland shark, Somniosus microcephalus, which sort of indirectly translates in Pig Latin as the sleepy pinhead? Really, there's been very, very little science done in this species until the last few years, and just in 2015, we've seen some very exciting papers published. But it's a deep sea shark. It's rare outside the Arctic because it's found in abyssal depths, and it's very hard to study both because of its habit and because of its location. Really, the first people who encountered Greenland sharks from the west, I mean, the Inuit people had known them for thousands of years, and that's a whole other story we can talk about another day. But it was the Scots whalers, the Scots and English whalers, who came up into Hudson's Bay, and as they were flensing whales by their ships, these ravenous sharks would come and arrive. And you'll see this image here is actually by the whaling captain, William Scoresby, they were fishing narwhal, and these other animals would come in. And Scoresby actually got it right. He even got the parasite correctly on the eye. What he got wrong was he thought the parasite on the eye, that little Y-shaped copepod, is actually part of the animal. And in fact, we've known for some time it's a parasite. So what do we know about Greenland sharks? We know they get very big, second largest after the white shark, tons in weight in some cases. We know they're found very deep. The latest record's over 11,000 feet, and there's only one shark species. And brownie points to the Dal crowd who tell me after this lecture, tell me the deeper species. They eat just about everything in the environment, as you can see from that stomach contents slide there, with everything from hagfish to pieces of polar bear. They're all over the world. Sleeper sharks are found in all the oceans, and the Greenland shark's found throughout the Atlantic. And most interestingly, recently there's evidence that the Greenland shark and the Pacific sleeper may have hybridized from recent paper. They were fished extensively at one time for oil. Now they're mainly a bycatch. People have called the Greenland shark the giant swimming nose. And this is some anatomical dissections I did of the head of a shark. So basically the shark's lying on its back with its nose pointed towards you. And if you look at the upper left image, you can see all the little canals and canaliculi on the head which communicate with the lateral line system. So these animals have very good acoustical lateral properties. They're really good at sensing pressure around them. If you look at the image on the right, I've dissected the top of the skull off, and what you're looking at are the olfactory nerves, and that round thing you see on the left there is actually the olfactory bulb, and the image on the lower left is actually the olfactory bulb dissected and teased out, and you can see how enormous it is. This thing probably has many square meters of surface area in its convolutions, and this is one of the adaptations these animals have. They cruise over the deep sea for long periods of time, basically scanning for prey items that may be miles away, and they detect them primarily, we think, through olfaction. What we don't know, well, virtually everything that a 10-year-old or even a 5-year-old would ask you about an animal is what we don't know. We don't know where they go. We don't know how many there are. We don't know where they breed. We don't know what their ecological role is, although there's some interesting thoughts on what that might be. We don't know how or where they breed. We certainly don't know all we should know about their sensory world, despite the fact that we've had many of these animals to look at anatomically. And I think one of the most fascinating things about the Greenland shark has to be we don't know how old they are. So there was a study done that indicated their growth rate was about 1/2 to 1 centimeter a year. These are animals that come out of their mother's womb, because they're a live bearer, at about 40 centimeters, and we know they get well over 6 meters. So you do the math on that. They may be hundreds and hundreds of years old. There is no reliable aging technique, which is, again, intriguing and a challenge for the future. The other thing is that in the Arctic anyway, almost 100% of these animals are bilaterally blind. And you can see in that image there, the copepod has caused fibrosis of the cornea. And basically the animal can probably see light and dark, and that's about it. So, you know, if you're a tiger and you can't see, you're a scavenger. But if you're a tiger and you can see, you're a tiger. So what is this doing to the sensorium of the animal, and in turn its ecological role as a predator? We don't really know. What's fascinating is the population that I co-discovered with Jeffrey Gallant in 2003 in the St. Lawrence has a very low rate of parasitism, and the animals are visual, and they behave quite differently underwater with us as a result. So the corkscrew killer, those of you who are Nova Scotians know about Sable Island, beautiful sandbar, 200 miles offshore in the North Atlantic. What you don't know is that between 1990 and 2015, almost 5,000 dead seals that look just like this washed up there. And Zoe Lucas and Lisa Natanson published in 2010 in the Nova Scotia proceedings their theory that these were in fact predatory events, and that the Greenland shark was a predator based on circumstantial evidence. Well, I've been out on Sable many times on research trips. I'd seen many of these kills wash ashore, and I was intrigued as well. Wasn't really sure what was doing it. And in 2010, I was contacted by a veterinarian in the UK, Steve Bexton, and he started sending me pictures of very similarly lesioned seals, these seals with the corkscrew cut around them. Really dramatic stuff. So Bexton did something that I had never thought of doing. No tissue deficit. He stitched one back together. There was no tissue missing. These seals were so fat that when you cut them, or whatever cut them, tissue would spring apart. It looked like there was something gone, but in fact there wasn't. So we had a lively correspondence about this, and it got me thinking again about what might be going on with these seals washing up at Sable. Identical type of lesion in a completely different part of the world. I was wondering about mechanical causes of these lesions. I've been swimming and diving with manatees in Florida, and I'd seen other animals that had propeller injuries, and they don't look anything like what you saw in the previous slide, do they? They look more like serial cuts. And so I started digging into it through a friend of mine who was a human pathologist, and there was a large volume of literature on propeller injuries, and because of the legal environment around that and the fact that people get sued, there were many professionals who were experts on this stuff, Turned out that the propeller injury literature didn't take me very far, and I did more and more digging, and eventually I found a paper by a Japanese author showing very different lesions from the ones seen elsewhere, and this was because you can see, this is a little gory, there's a human cadaver there and a seal below it, and you can see the same sort of spiral lesion, and it turns out that the propeller involved is a very low RPM, wide blade, low pitch propeller seen on fishing boats only in Japan. Well, the question, and these sorts of boats didn't exist in the areas where we were seeing these injuries, but it was very suggestive that the lesions looked pretty similar, whether you were a human or a seal getting ingested by the propeller. So in 2010, Bexton actually found a seal that had the mark of a line cutter on its face, and you can see the line cutter lesion seal on the lower left there, and that's a line cutter. This is something that sits around the propeller, cuts a line if it gets entrained in it to prevent the boat from being snagged up, and a pretty well perfect imprint of that. And that's pretty well the smoking gun, I think, that determined that this was very likely to be the cause of death in these seals. And you can see a sable seal on the upper right there and a Dorset seal on the lower right there, and pretty much the same thing going on. So figure that this is probably what was going on, but the smoking gun was there, but what was the actual cause? And when we looked into it, it turned out that Sable and Dorset had something in common. So there's an oil rig supply vessel, and they use these dynamic positioning systems to allow the vessel to stay in one place, and these use ducted propellers that turn off and on, and they do this intermittently and without warning. Same thing going on in Dorset. Off the coast where this was happening, they were building wind farms, they were pile driving using DPS vessels. So that was a smoking gun, and there's the culprit. It's called the Court nozzle, and it's it's called an azimuth propeller or thrusted propeller. Generates huge force to hold the ship in one position. And of course, if you happen to be swimming by and it turns on, you'll get sucked right through it, and those are the lesions. So I'm pretty confident that the lesions we're seeing at Sable are being caused by vessels that have DPS systems. The other smoking gun thing is that I've looked at an awful lot of lesions now caused by Greenland sharks, and they don't look anything like those corkscrew lesions. So you can see most sharks there on the left, a sort of extreme example of the overbite, but most sharks that we know bite, and the overbite portion is what removes the tissue. 6 gills, 7 gills, and sleeper sharks all use an underbite method, more like an ice cream scoop going through the tissue. And you can see how different that lesion on the lower right looks. It looks like a bowl that's been taken out. It doesn't look anything like these corkscrew lesions. So again, circumstantial evidence such as it is, I still believe that the lesions are being caused by mechanical means, man-made means. Coming back to Canada, the Saguenay region on the North Shore historically was a place where people caught Greenland sharks ice fishing, some of them monsters like the animal you can see at the upper left, and they would even badly stuff them and hang them in their recreation rooms like the chap on the lower left there. Put an ad in a paper there and had all kinds of people show up with pictures, but this was completely not in the scientific literature at the time. It was in the gray literature, it was seen in newspapers and magazines, but the presence of the Greenland shark wasn't really appreciated. Until in 2003, after a number of years of ice diving trips up there to try and see Greenland sharks, we got a report of a man working on a dock underwater, and he saw something big swim by, and he thought it was a whale, but it had a vertical tail, not a horizontal tail. Pretty much decided that likely he saw a shark. So we went to the site, and within 24 hours in that bay you see on the right side there, near Bay Comeau on the North Shore, we saw our first Greenland shark swimming out in open water, which was quite exciting, as you can imagine. So we noticed a bunch of things about these animals. There we go. So one thing was the surface anatomy, which in some cases isn't even in the scientific illustration. So they had very prominent spiracles on the back of the head. They had wrinkles along their sides, which you tend to see in deep sea animals. They had these visible dental bands, which you can see in the upper right side picture. You can actually see this white band, which is this row of teeth that fold out and slot and are used to excavate big chunks of tissue. And they had a very dorsal lateral line. If you look at that lower right picture, you can see it's sort of 3/4 of the way up the side of the animal. And because these animals tend to cruise on the bottom, lends you to believe that they're probably actually kind of scanning the water column above, looking for prey items. And I'll show you some data that might also sort of support that idea. They also had a very large caudal keel. Now we see this in sharks like makos and whites and fast swimming lamnid sharks. It's a water splitter. To see it in a slow-moving shark like a Greenland shark is very unexpected. So a lot of things that are a bit enigmatic about this species. Another thing was this was in bad visibility in cold water, and we had a lot of very close encounters, feet away, a couple of feet away a lot of the time, as you can see from the perspective of the images. And the sharks would sometimes do this behavior where if you got too close to them, they sort of slow down and put their pectoral fins down and their tail would go up and they just kind of stall for a while, sometimes 10 or 15 seconds. Then they'd resume and swim away. And a lot of the elements of that display are seen in many other species of sharks and famously were characterized first in the gray reef shark in a more extreme form. So to me, it's very interesting that we see the conservation of basic behaviors like the agonistic behavior well across species lines in sharks and even in the Greenland shark. So started doing acoustic telemetry studies in 2004, and we did this with the help of Dr. Fred Wariski, who's here in Halifax now with the Ocean Tracking Network, and Fred and I have just started a new project working on tracking of Atlantic torpedo rays, also never been done before. We tagged our first one about 3 weeks ago. So Fred has been a friend to my studies and has helped out for decades now, really. And he was a silent partner and provided us with much of the equipment because we had no grants or any way to move forward on this. So many thanks to him. And much of the equipment was handmade. If you look at that tagger in the middle there, I made that. And I even made the dart and the attachment system because at that time they weren't commercially available. I got a piece of stainless steel and filed these things up. These are acoustic tags. So they're basically a very simple, robust system that takes data and turns it into sound trains of pings. And the pings can entrain a lot of information. And this includes things like depth and temperature, and even gives some location information. You have to put receivers down on the bottom. And you can see that shark with the tag on its back, that big white spot. The tag is actually a V16, that little red tag there, but it's severely biofouled with small invertebrates, and in turn it's causing some damage to the outside of the animal. So in later iterations, we made these so they'd break away after a year. I made the links a little differently. So it's more benign than standard fishery science the way we do this. We're not catching the animals and cutting them up. We're in fact doing very non-invasive things and trying to keep it as least invasive as we can because these are fairly rare and valuable animals and we don't want to harm them in the course of doing this. So we tagged quite a number of these animals over the years, and we published a paper in 2005 that did very well in the journal Marine Biology. Is in the top 1% of citations for that year. But the telemetry studies are what I'm going to tell you about, and we thought from some of the data here that it's pointing towards what's called a diel behavior pattern. There's a difference in how these animals react day and night. And the first interesting thing, if you look over a 24-hour day, which is what you're looking at along the long axis of this graph, and the black dots are the median values, the whiskers are the extremes. So you can see that these animals are basically selecting shallow depths at night, and in the daytime, when it's light, they're down on the bottom. So they're basically up and then down. And they do this very consistently. There's something like 38,000 data points that went into doing that slide, so we know this is pretty robust data. Here's a single animal's record, and this demonstrates it much more dramatically, which is you can see the nighttime hours starting on the left there, and then as you get into the daytime, so the animal's basically migrating up and down the water column about every 20 minutes. It's probably sampling the water column, looking for something. And then as daytime comes on, it gets down on the bottom. It does the odd high migration, but mostly it's down at 180 to 200 feet, and then starts coming back up into shallow water again in the nighttime. Sort of a night hunting pattern. And other sharks are known to do this. White sharks, for instance, are known to do this. The other interesting thing is that we found sharks anywhere from 14 degrees centigrade water, but most of the time we were finding them in water that was 1, 2, 3 degrees, very, very cold St. Lawrence salt water. And you can see when we look at the telemetry data, what we see diving is what the animals are sampling. They seem to really prefer that temperature around 2, 3 degrees centigrade. And just this year, another paper published in 2015 by Campana et al. Basically shows the same thing in a different population. So they can exist over wide temperature ranges, wider than we thought, but they really prefer those cooler temperature ranges. They can exist over wide depth ranges, but they have a fairly narrow bandwidth when they're given the choice of usually around 300 meters seems to be where they like to hang out. This, we had the opportunity to deploy some pop-up satellite telemetry, which basically you attach to the animal a tag and then it releases at a predetermined number of days after, in this case 3 months after. And what we found was that we tagged a male and a female animal. The female's tag released 3 months later, about 4 kilometers from the tagging location. The male had moved a couple of 100 kilometers up the St. Lawrence, and he'd gone up to the Tadoussac area, which is where there are a lot of marine mammals, blue whales, belugas, seals, and he was hanging out up there. So if these animals are in fact a carcass scavenger or even maybe a seal predator, that would have made sense. Since then, again, other researchers have tagged Greenland sharks, and in the last year published that they do very long migrations, as long as 1,400 kilometers in a 6-month period. So they can move a very, very great distance. None of this was known previously. I think for me, and just to wind up this talk, the most intriguing thing about being one of the first people to swim and dive and see the behavior of these animals close up and watch how they react to us, has been this tension around whether we're dealing with an animal that's a predator or a scavenger. And there have been wild things in the press about these animals ambushing caribou during their migration, swimming across rivers, and other various and sundry claims about them. And I think, in fact, what we have is an animal that more closely approximates maybe a hyena if you're looking in terrestrial terms. It's an animal that can be a predator and a scavenger. It's an opportunistic animal. And the big thing about this animal is it moves at about 20 centimeters a second most of the time. So it is moving about that fast. You don't catch a lot of fast-moving prey that way. But if you were sick or blind or otherwise affected, Greenland shark might get you. And I had a face-to-face encounter with a Greenland shark in very bad visibility in 2004 that left me with little doubt that in bad visibility, where their stealth works, they can definitely get close enough to you for a predatory event. But overall, I don't think they really represent any kind of hazard to humans. So that's a conclusion to my talk about Greenland sharks, and I'd be happy to entertain questions. Just to acknowledge all the people as well who contributed to this. And first and foremost, Jeffrey Gallant, who started the Greenland Shark and Elasmobranch Education and Research Group. The volunteers really are the ones who did the heavy lifting. Alain Simard, Johnny Foray, John Batt, who's our Aquatron manager here. These were all the people who early on, when we had no idea what we were dealing with, were willing to go into the environment and dive with and experience firsthand these animals. Others, Fred Wariski, I've mentioned. Mike Stokesbury, who's a professor now at Acadia University and did his graduate PhD work in part on Greenland sharks, in part on bluefin tuna. And it was his supervisor, Barbara Block, who was kind enough to give us the first PSAT tags we were able to deploy. So,
okay, so
go ahead.
Questions from online.
Sure. Yeah. So the question is, you know, I mentioned during the lecture, we have no idea how many of these animals are out there, and it makes it very difficult to, for instance, get interest in, you know, should we be looking at some form of protection for them. It appears in the Arctic they can be very, very abundant. I was working in a fjord in eastern Greenland off one village which had caught 3,000 sharks in the previous year. We fished there to catch sharks to put telemetry on them, and we had no problem catching 30 or 40 sharks in a couple of days. So in certain areas, these sharks are extremely abundant, but in most areas they're not. They're sparse. And certainly off the Nova Scotia coast here, we see the odd shark in the halibut fishery in the wintertime, maybe one per trip. So they're not thick out there. Certain areas they likely are, but most places not. Worldwide population, nobody has a clue. Next question.
Another question from the web is, what part of the world are they known to inhabit?
So sleeper sharks, the five, so the question is, where are sleeper sharks found? And the answer is, of the 5 sleeper shark species, they're found in every ocean of the world, and particularly in deep, cold water. You will find these animals. The Greenland shark, which is the Atlantic sleeper shark, is found right from Greenland, Iceland, up under the Arctic ice cap on the Canadian side. And what's really interesting is it appears that there's some evidence in the last year that there may be some flow from the Pacific sleeper shark, which is on the other side, you know, Alaska, Beaufort Sea. There may be some gene flow going across. There may be some interbreeding, because work by Aaron Fisk and others And Nigel Hussey particularly has shown that there are markers, genetic markers in some of the Atlantic Greenland sharks that indicate that there's some presence of genetic material from Pacific. So anyway, right down to through the tropics, because of course they're in the deep sea areas there where it's cold, right down to the tip of South America, across to the Azores, the coast of Africa and deep water. These are deep water sharks, like I said, 3,000 meters. So they're found swimming over abyssal depths right throughout the North Atlantic. And they're probably solitary animals that roam over very, very large ranges and opportunistically scavenge sunken carcasses as they go. And there's a whole other story that's very interesting around that. But they're ubiquitous. The sleeper sharks are in all the oceans of the world. Another question?
Do they have a really wide salinity tolerance? Because you mentioned that they migrate a lot and they seem to be in coastal areas on your maps and where you found them on Greenland.
Yeah.
So do they also tolerate the hydro salinities?
Okay, so the question is, what's the salinity tolerance of Greenland sharks? Nobody's ever done physiology on Greenland sharks to show, we can keep them at 10 parts per thousand or 30 parts per thousand. But we find them everywhere from off the mouths of rivers in the Arctic, which are, probably somewhat lower salinity, 20 parts per thousand, where normal seawater would be about 33, right to, deep ocean areas where it's up at 35 parts per thousand. So they seem to have a pretty wide temperature tolerance. When you dissect a Greenland shark, you find that they have quite a large, there's an organ called the rectal gland. It's a little thing like the kidney. They also have big kidneys, but they have this little structure that's at the terminal end of their digestive tract called the rectal gland, and it is involved in saline clearance. And you find larger rectal glands in the species that tend to move up into fresh water, like the bull shark classically has a giant rectal gland. These guys, proportionally, it's a little smaller, but it's still pretty big. It's the size of your fist in a good-sized Greenland shark. So I think they can tolerate some change in salinity. And because they do these vertical migrations, that's another thing that happens is you go up and down in the water column, the salinity changes. So there's some advantage to be able to clear that sodium as you go up and down.
You mentioned you saw like daily oscillations when you looked at their diving behavior. Would you expect that to, or how would you expect that to change with the Arctic population, seeing as you're not the
Very good question is, are these diel migration patterns that we saw in the St. Lawrence Baie-Comeau region seen in Greenland sharks elsewhere? And until this year, nobody done that work anywhere else. And there's some very interesting data from the Campana paper that was published this last year that, in fact, the sharks they're tagging, they tag these sharks and they swim vast distances Davis Strait, and they pretty much stay at the same depth. They're around, depending on where you're at, one group clusters around 1,100 meters, and the other group clusters around 300-400 meters, and they don't do this up and down. But they may also be transiting. There may be another reason for what's going on there. One of the noteworthy things is up in that area, which is east of Baffin Island. Nigel Hussey has caught and tagged the smallest Greenland sharks we've ever seen. They're about this big. They're babies. That's never been seen before. In fact, there's almost no records of Greenland sharks under 2 meters. So we have big, long migrations happening quite quickly, and we have a lot of babies. And one of the things, not a lot, I think 5 in that small size range, but still, it begs the question, what's going on up there? Is that a nursery area? It could well be. We see something like that with 6-gill sharks in Puget Sound on the west coast. 6 gills, we get monsters coming up into Puget Sound, and then we get a lot of babies. So big mums come up, drop their pups in a very prey-rich, lower salinity estuary, and then they go back out to the continental shelf. So maybe we're seeing something like that up in the Arctic off the east coast of Baffin. That's just a surmise. I don't think we have any real evidence of that. I hope that answered your question. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering what might prey on Greenland sharks.
I'm really glad somebody thought to ask the question, what eats a Greenland shark? Because there's a great story there. And the story really starts on the west coast off Vancouver Island with John Ford, who's an orca researcher. And Ford and his colleagues were following a bunch of orcas that belonged to a population called offshore orcas. Most people know we have resident orcas who are salmon eaters, and we have transient orcas that range very widely, don't speak the same language as the residents, and they're primarily marine mammal eaters. What most people don't know is there's a third population called offshore orcas. And nobody could figure out what offshore orcas were exactly up to, but morphologically, the teeth of all three types of orca are different. So the offshores have flattened plate-like teeth. The residents have these sort of cone-shaped teeth, and the transients have kind of sharky-looking teeth, as you'd expect. So John Ford and his colleagues are up in Hecate Strait, following a bunch of these offshore orcas, and all of a sudden, stuff starts to pop up to the surface, chunks of stuff, and they collect the stuff. And it turns out the stuff collected over about an 8-hour day are the livers of no less than, I think, 9 different Pacific sleeper sharks. These orcas, this particular group, specialized in eating the livers and the viscera of these deep sea sharks. So, you know, it begs the question, why? Well, you know, it's another whodunit. It's a fascinating story because they're big, they're slow moving, they're not very able to defend themselves. They got a nice big liver and lots of goodies. They're easy to catch. No brainer for a smart predator like an orca. Well, interestingly enough, there is some evidence that we may be seeing something very similar on the East Coast. And it's an anecdote, it's not a study. I can tell you what happened was in 2009 at the study site, I was diving there with some of the other people in the group. We were doing a transect, and for the previous few days, we'd seen a sperm whale that lived in the area. It was a known animal, it was a named animal called Trifon, and it was a big male sperm whale, about 50 feet long. And he was seen within about 300 meters of where we were diving that day. We'd seen him before we went in the water. We saw a large female somniosus, probably close to 4 meters long, swimming past us faster than I've ever seen one swim before. And I have video of this. Her head was all expanded, her mouth was open, and she was ram ventilating. Ram ventilation is something that tuna and fast-swimming sharks do when they're really exercising hard. They can extract more oxygen that way. So we had a ram ventilating shark skedaddling as fast as possible. I had video. I showed the video to Hal Whitehead. Some of you may know Dr. Hal Whitehead. He's a sperm whale biologist at Dal. And Hal wasn't particularly perturbed about the shark, but he was very interested in the sounds. And I hadn't noticed it because they don't sound like, you know, the usual sort of whale sounds, but there's very, very tuck sound like that you could hear on the soundtrack of the video. And these are foraging echolocation by sperm whales. They use this to find prey. So it's an interesting anecdote. I wouldn't call it a study, but we have a scared, get out of town kind of situation for that particular sleeper shark. We have a sperm whale nearby, and we have foraging. So I went back and looked at the literature, and going right back to the 50s, there are several papers that indicate that sperm whales have been found with the remains of somniosus in their stomachs. So it may very well be, and we were in a hot spot for that species there, so that may be why Trifon was hanging around that area. Now, years later, he died. He was entangled in gear and washed up on shore, and somebody from GREM, which are the marine mammal people in Quebec, sent me pictures of him, including his teeth. Well, guess what? His teeth were all worn down, just like the orcas on the West Coast. So it's a just-so story, but it's a fascinating one. And it's quite possible that Trifon might have been in that area because we saw a lot of Greenland sharks in that area for a while. So I hope that answers the question. Well, I can tell you about a eureka moment. And, you know, the first year I encountered Greenland sharks underwater, they were moving very slowly. They would do certain things that were pretty interesting. You'd encounter one, and it was murky, dark water, which is what they like, by the way. We've had far fewer sightings in recent years because the water in the area is warmer and clearer, and just doesn't seem to be the sort of conditions that those sharks like. The darker and the murkier it is, the more sharks we see as a rule. And that may just be because of light. But the first year watching these sharks and their behavior and trying to figure out how on earth something that only moves about that quick has been found to have, you know, up to 30% of stomach contents as marine mammals, as seals. And, you know, seals are very lively, large-brained, fast-moving, agile, able to avoid predator-type animals. And here you've got this lumbering creature that doesn't appear to be able to move very quickly, and yet they have stomach contents consisting of seals. So the question is predator, scavenger. We certainly have evidence that from deep-sea cameras and so on carcasses that the Greenland sharks will come in and latch on and sort of drive their jaws through the prey, but nothing like kind of an ambush type of situation. So by the end of that first year where we'd had a number of days in the water with the animals, and I mean, you never feel, I wouldn't say I've ever felt safe in the water swimming with and observing these animals, but I felt an element of not safety, but certainly assurance that I wasn't necessarily going to be injured by one. And so that was the first year. It was the first time anybody had ever seen that number of animals or had that number of encounters under natural circumstances. And the previous person who had seen and dove with Greenland sharks was a National Geographic photographer named Nick Kalianos, and he got the cover of Nat Geo a couple of times with underwater images of sharks shot in the Arctic. And you can see clearly in the pictures, they would catch the sharks and then they'd tie a rope around their tail, hang them in the water, and the divers would go in and take pictures of them. Whereas what we were experiencing was, these animals were coming in for unknown reasons into a long, narrow, shallow fjord and repeatedly encountering us, and sometimes multiple animals. And we had no idea what was going on. We started looking at age and sex ratios and things like that, and measuring the animals. I developed a way to measure them underwater using lasers. And they were all consistently, the males, the median fork length was about 2.6. Fork length is from the nose to the fork of the tail. And in the females, it was about 2.1. So the males appeared to be sexually mature. The females probably weren't. The females likely don't sexually mature till they're about 4 meters long, a real monster shark. At that point, they're 600-700 kilos. Anyway, so we're down there swimming with these animals, trying to figure out how on earth can something like this possibly catch a seal. Don't think it's possible. I'm really starting to lean more towards the scavenger versus predator part of the theory. Well, the next year we went back to the same area. We had volunteers working in the area with us who would dive the sites regularly, and they hadn't seen any sharks at all. And so we went back on the anniversary dates, which were early in the summer. It was the end of May, beginning of June, and we hit the area hard with about 8 people. Really a very inefficient way to survey. You just put a bunch of divers in and you run coordinate transects up and down these bays where we were seeing the sharks. Didn't see anything. Mind you, the visibility was only about 8 feet. You could have swum right past one and not noticed it. And we were there all week. This is all personally private, my own pocket funding this on my part. And after we sort of ran out of money and, paid our last hotel bills and the cars were loaded and we were ready to leave because we'd failed. We'd had one season of seeing them and then the next season, nothing. And pretty much come to the conclusion that 2003 was unique in history because people had been diving in that area for 30 years, never seen a Greenland shark there. And on the last day, we went up into a bay called Baie des Anglais, which is this bay that sort of slopes down to very deep water. And it's right next to this rather sinister-looking giant aluminum smelter. And it was horrible weather. It had been raining, and the runoff and visibility was 2-3 feet. So my colleague Jeffrey and I jumped in the water, and we were anchored up in shallow water, about 15 feet of water. Went down to the bottom, basically ran into the bottom because the visibility was so bad. And we noticed a very large aggregation of snow crabs in the area. The bottom was just paved with them. So we wanted to go out and get a few pictures of the snow crabs. So we hit the bottom, and I was fiddling with my camera, and I looked up, and this Greenland shark just went right by like that, right at my head. And it was, wow, I just couldn't believe it. And I could only see about maybe 18 inches. And so I was surprised, a little scared. I had my camera just sparked up, ready to go, so I took off after it. I thought it's better if I can keep this thing in sight. So I followed it, and I had my camera rolling, and I could see about this much of its tail. So we went about 400 meters, and we finally punched through all the murky surface water that went down to about 90 feet, and we got underneath that, and it was pitch black because the upper level water had taken all the light away, but it was crystal clear and ice cold salt water. Suddenly I could see I had about a 10-foot male in front of me, and I circled him several times and got images of him because we actually use that to identify the sharks. We shoot left side, right side, top, bottom, genital area, And then if I have the lasers on, we get a lateral shot so we can scale the shark up. And if we have the tagging crew, we tag. But anyway, so I'd exhausted my air by now. I was alone, went to the surface, swam back, and I was swimming over this deep abyss that goes down to about 500 feet and wondering what the heck else was down underneath me there. I got back to the boat, and my colleague Jeffrey, who'd come in the water with me, we were only a few feet away, and and he hadn't seen anything. Other people were in the water. They hadn't seen anything. Compared notes, and he said, yeah, I saw you go by a couple of times. And I said, that wasn't me. That was the shark. So the shark had been hanging around us for a couple of minutes and finally came in on a run, and probably got close enough that electroreception and other things told it that we weren't a prey item, or I wasn't a prey item. But it really taught me something, which is these animals are absolute masters in stealth, and they can get right on top of you before you can react. And if the shark had decided it wanted to give me a little nip, it certainly could have done so. So it was definitely a eureka moment, and that was the moment when I realized, well, if you were a sleeping seal or a young seal, and we think these sharks are probably pedivores, we think they probably eat young, inexperienced, predator-naive seals, then that could have been like the last moments of a seal's life I just experienced there. So I think there's a possibility in certain circumstances they could be pretty effective predators. I'll tell you another anecdote, which is we kind of avoided, after that season where we had a lot of sharks and some of them a bit aggressive, we kind of avoided diving at night. We dive at dusk, but not at night because bad visibility, period, and then you put dark on top of that, it gets very hard to see what's down there. But we actually used a remote operated vehicle that had a sonar on it. So the sonar operator, sort of like having a bird dog, we could send the ROV down and it would scan the water, find a shark, and then we'd follow the umbilical out to it. So we did some night diving with that, and the astounding thing there was that we come back after the dive, and we had no comms or communication or anything like that. We'd come back, and the operator's eyes would be as big as saucers, and he'd say, there's sharks all around you down there. We would have done an entire transect with big lights, not seen one. So again, it's a learning moment, which is these sharks are very good at not being seen, and that's probably part of their strategy. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us today, those of you in the audience here and those joining us on the webcast. The Discovery Centre is a nonprofit organization providing hands-on, minds-on science to Nova Scotians. And also the Vancouver Aquarium is another nonprofit organization committed to conserving aquatic life. If you want to support the Discovery Centre and its programs, please visit us at www.thediscoverycentre.ca. And also, if you want to support the Vancouver Aquarium, their website is vanaqua.org. Again, please join me in thanking Dr. Chris Harvey-Clark for the wonderful presentation on Greenland sharks.